Okay, so decided to go live here. I've been, spent pretty much all the day here just researching, contemplating all of the things that are happening in our world. And today, happy full moon in Leo, by the way, and today is usually the day that I send out my Druid newsletter, which I'll be sending out soon to recipients. And I usually do a written transmission, but today I felt called to do a video on some of the insights that I've been receiving through the astrology with what's going on in the world. I thought it would be a better way to sort of express and share all the things that have been coming up. So I'm coming to you here from my Druid den in Costa Rica. It's a blustery, windy day. It feels very Neptunian in Aries. It feels like the winds are strong and are slowly blowing away the fogs of illusion, which is one of the great themes of this Neptune in Aries that is happening today. And of course, I made a post last night about the horrors of the Epstein files that are hitting the world, the horrors of so many things that are happening in the world that is so rife with conflict right now. And so let's dive into some of the astrology to figure out what is really going on and what is needed in this time. What are we being primed to come to awareness embodiment of from the stars and the universe? So firstly, Neptune in Aries, we've got a Leo full moon, very powerful time. Neptune went into Aries January 26th. It's going to be there until, I believe, for 13 or so years. So it's going to be a very long cycle, and that's why it's good to reflect on the cycle that we're now coming into so that we become aware of the themes. And of course, what I love about astrology is it churns our mythological archetypal consciousness. It really helps us to see the transpersonal and to see what is going on in the world beyond just our personal reactions. So this is really about, one of the themes is spiritual courage. So Neptune is a sign of spirituality and mysticism, but it's also the sign of illusion and disillusionment. This is one of the keys of spirituality, though, is about the inner work of becoming present enough so that we can be truly discerning, which is seen to be one of the powers of the heart, not necessarily the intellect, which is how we've been sort of conditioned to run in our world, in this patriarchal world, where we just think things through analytically, bouncing things between the duality of the left and right hemisphere. Whereas when we meditate and we enact a more spiritual consciousness, a more unifying consciousness, we get in touch with that bridge between the brain, the corpus callosum, that helps us to create synthesis in our ideas. But this really reminds me of that time, thousands of years ago, when the Gnostics came out of the mystery schools to debate the religious zealots, the Judeo-Christians, who were kind of moving away from the essence of those beautiful faiths. So this also reminds me of the theme of the sage who ascends the mountain to achieve this great vista of awareness, of universal vision of everything that is going on. But they don't stay there as a renunciate monk. They actually come down the mountain to enter into the village to give service, to really give a practicality to their mysticism. And this is one of the themes that I'm seeing, is that many of us who are involved in this spiritual awakening that is happening in the planet, a lot of spirituality has been captured around a self-serving mission, when in reality, spirituality is about transpersonal. It's about making oneself a more excellent, virtuous being, exuding what the Taoists would call the marvelous impulses, those unifying principles of virtue, so that we can be of better service to our families, to our friends, to our communities, and to the larger world. And it is time to realize that our whatever practices that we're undertaking, yoga, meditation, prayer, these are practical practices, and it is time for us to, with Leo, to be visible about these practices and to show that these practices are very important medicines for the world, because it's really about an inner adjustment. I was reflecting on this past week. I had some really beautiful conversations with friends, and we were talking with one friend about how, all of the problems that are besieging us in the world, whether it's the conflict in the Middle East, which is potentially erupting into a world war with Iran and Russia, and who knows what other players want to get involved, whether it's the Epstein files and the horrors that we're seeing there, whether it's what's going on domestically in some of our countries like Canada and America and Europe. These are problems that are symptoms of, I get the gecko, we always say the geckos like chirp us when we're speaking truth, symptoms of a deeper problem, which is the consciousness of humanity is wounded. And what wounded consciousness looks like is we're more identified with our unconscious. We are literally asleep. And when we're asleep, we don't have the powers of discernment. We're more vulnerable to fall into emotional reactivity. We're more vulnerable to falling into the absolutism of seeing polarities, rather than understanding that the solution often involves in something more unifying. So we have to be very aware of that. It's very tough, you know. I follow conspiracy culture as well. You know, I'm very interested in knowing truth, and I believe that, you know, one of the great themes of our age is that we are in this Neptune and Aries where the illusions are being ripped away. But Neptune is not necessarily about exposing illusions. It's not known as the truth teller. It's more about exposing the working of illusions so that we become more aware that in the field of our awareness we have to be very discerning so that we don't get possessed in distortions and false stories. So I see this Epstein release as like so Neptunian and Aries, because we're just being throttled with all these horrific anecdotes from all these powerful people in the world who are being unmasked, and we're seeing that they're very compromised and they're lost in their woundedness, and they're doing insanely predatory and horrible things to other humans. And there's no justice. There's no arrests being made. So there's this, like, the Aries in us is like outraged, of course. It wants to act. It wants justice. And yet the Neptunian part is like, aha, there's going to be no justice immediately. And Neptune is also trying to get us to realize there's probably much more to the picture, because there's so many veils that we have to go through. So we have to bear that in mind, that although everything's being thrown at us, I believe it's being thrown at us to make us upset, to make us so angry that we become destabilized and we lose centeredness in our heart. And this is one of the shadows of Neptune, is that it can, you know, it unmasks, but it can throw on new masks right away. So we might see, you know, messiah complexes happening and spiritual crusades, weaponizing our spirituality. It also takes us into demonization, you know, where we're so fiercely opposing something before the illusion is fully understood. And this is something that Nietzsche counseled against. He said, if you oppose monsters, be careful that you don't become monstrous yourself. So we have to protect our psyches. That's a very important thing that's happening. And Leo, you know, is ruled by the sun. Leo is very connected to the heart. It's like this warm, heart-led leader in us. And the Leo full moon is really asking us to hold fierce compassion primarily. You know, we have to begin with love and compassion primarily. And that doesn't mean that love is a form of weakness, that we allow, that we permit things to happen in the world, that we don't hold people accountable, that we don't have boundaries. Wise love does all those things. But as one of my favorite quotes goes by Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian philosopher and author, everything that I understand in the world, I understand because I love. I go into compassion first, because when you go into the heart is connected to the unified field. We know this scientifically. When you try and understand things mentally through the brain, through the intellect, it's based on duality, whereas the heart is based on unity. So we want to go into the heart first, build compassion, build love, especially if we're going to be looking and reading horrifying details about the world, because it's so quick that we can be like knocked off center, shocked into disillusionment, and go into hatred. And then we just further the polarization. And that is really not the solution. So Leo is really about having that courage to live by the heart in a world that doesn't prize heart intelligence. It prizes intellectual, masculine intelligence. Whereas the heart intelligence is really where true discernment happens, because the heart has access to that bigger unified field, as we know now through the Heart Math Institute and science. This is what the Gnostics called cardiognosis, knowing by the heart. The Gnostics also believed that the heart is where we are in touch with this endless wellspring of guiding wisdom, what the Taoists called the guiding realm. So the challenge of Leo full moon in this Neptune and Aries new cycle is, can we stay connected to our hearts and not capsize into shock and emotional reaction? Although those things have their place and we might want to give them the space, but primarily we want to keep coming back to our hearts so that we don't start acting out of hatred, out of polarity. And I've seen this in myself. This is something that I've acted out, especially with the Middle East conflict, something that I've been studying for a very long time. And I've noticed if you get too close to that conflict, there's so much polarization. And I've seen myself get polarized in that conflict and start arguing and debating people without compassion leading it. And then, we're all of a sudden name calling and do all kinds of profane things that we don't want to do to each other, because that just furthers the divide. So the big thing, to really focus on with Neptune and Aries, so this is going to be for about the next 13 years, is humanity is being initiated into the spiritual warrior. So what does that look like to discern through all the woo-woo? So the spiritual warrior is something that we can actually draw. There's a lot of archetypes about the spiritual warrior that we can actually really draw upon. We have from the Cree Native Americans, we have the Rainbow Warrior prophecy. From the Tibetan Buddhists, we have the Shambhala Warrior prophecy. I would even throw in, to connect with Leo, the White Lion prophecy, which we're living in right now. And then to borrow from Hinduism and the Vedic sages of India, we also have the prophecy of Kalki, which is the final incarnation of Vishnu in this darkest of age, the Kali Yuga. And Kalki is said to personify the masculine embodiment of the rage of the feminine. But what really is important here to configure with Kalki is about the marriage of the masculine and the feminine. And Kalki rides this white sword, or rather this white horse, which is a sign of the purity of our consciousness, so that we can really discern things. And then the sword that Kalki holds is that weapon of discernment, so that we can cut through all the stories that would possess us, all the disillusionment. The spiritual warrior in Neptune, Aries and Neptune, is also about not having conclusions in our life. It's about realizing that there is a great mystery that we are a part of, which is very hard when we see, for example, the Epstein files. We want to jump to conclusions. We want to demonize people. We want solutions. But Neptune and Aries is saying, we're not going to have that absolute moment quite yet. That may come later. But we have to embrace the uncertainty and act within the uncertainty, which means to have faith in the process of life, to have faith that justice will come, perhaps not in the ways that we want, perhaps not, on CNN or some of the mainstream media or with our governments. So Neptune is really about unveiling, but it's also about unveiling so that we can see our projections. Where are we projecting our own veils on the world? So you could say Neptune and Aries is really about fire meeting fog. Aries is this very fiery warrior-like energy, and it wants to act in the world. It wants to move forward, and yet Neptune just throws all this fog at it. So it's asking us to slow down our conclusions, slow down the need to act out of reaction, and rather slow down so that we're not acting out of this kind of urgency, which may be compromising the clarity of thinking needed to actually have right action in the world, as the Buddhists would say. So Neptune is really about identities being burned and dissolved, but it's also about really dissolving the meaning of the world, which can be very destabilizing. So when you look at the Epstein files, for example, we're seeing all these world leaders, all these celebrities, all these people that have been exalted in this kind of matrix system being unmasked. And that's really shaking the meaning of the world for a lot of people. I'll never forget when I first started doing my own investigations after studying media at university. One of the first things I investigated was 9/11. And when I started to realize the corruption and the lies in that, I went into a 6-month dark depression, because my whole sense of the world was completely uprooted, and I had no idea what was true in the world anymore. The only reason I was able to come out of that is I had had a spiritual awakening at the same time. And I was reading all these beautiful texts, all these beautiful scriptures from all the different religions, all these great sages. And I started to realize, wait, there is a way out of it. It's about working on our spiritual powers of true powerful love, of true discernment, of realizing that spirituality is also about evolving our abilities, our psychic abilities, our spiritual abilities, our abilities to heal each other. So when that happens, when we see these shocking moments on the world stage and the old narratives have lost their spell, we can no longer look at these authority figures in the world and have deep trust or even respect for them. And that creates a lot of instability. And so we have to look at that instability. We have to hold it. We can't allow that to consume us. So it's about how can we hold this fiery reaction without burning up in it? How can we live beyond the matrix? Because that's also what Neptune in Aries is asking us, is if this old world order is being dissolved, we have to spend a lot of our creative time, the creative pioneer, which is also very Leo, we have to focus on what we want to create in its place. And this is one of the quagmires that we get into in this time of great upheaval and great unmasking and exposure, is that we're liable to almost fetishize the enemy, the darkness, and become so opposed to it that we don't spend any time actually building, a right and just society in whatever way that looks like in our lives. Neptune is also known as the cosmic ocean. It's where the ego goes to drown and dissolve. And if you think about, the unified quantum field, which you could say is an expression of Neptune, forms are endlessly coming up and dissolving, dissolving in what the Vedic sages would say, the Leela, the cosmic play. So it is a time of just embracing that there is this element of reality where forms are just perpetually transforming and changing, and it's hard to know what is true and what is certain, and we have to actually embrace that mystery. That's why apparently King Arthur had a 13th chair at the round table, just for mystery, to always honor that as much as we want to draw conclusions and to act from some sort of absolutism, all-knowingness, there is always an inherent mystery to existence. This kind of paradoxical thinking also made me think of Ganesha, the Hindu deity, because a lot of people focus on Ganesha. I know for a long time I was like, oh yeah, Ganesha, the smiling, benevolent, seemingly elephant god that removes obstacles. But when you study Ganesha deeper, you realize Ganesha is an initiator, because Ganesha actually puts the obstacles in front of us, not to punish us, but to actually put us through an initiatory experience, to actually take our ego's inflations and grandiosities to serve more of the embodiment where the soul is the captain of our identity. And then the obstacles are removed only when we have earned that progression, only when it is deemed by that universal intelligence that we've achieved that station of consciousness to move through it. So these Neptune cycles can be very confusing. They almost humiliate certainty. And they are initiatory rather than informative. So as much as we are living in this information age and we have all this information coming to us, and I fall into this trap too, where you're just reading and you're studying all these different things. Ancient wisdom is one of my loves, but also like going into all the conspiracies of the world. But then all of a sudden you're just like backed up with all this information. You haven't taken any actions. In fact, that information may have just polarized you even more, because some of the stuff that you read in conspiracy theories is so disturbing. So we have to be careful that we don't fall into the shadow of Neptune in Aries, which is acting before fully knowing with clarity what is going on. So this falls into, the dynamic of heroes rising before they are ready. And I'm reminded here of, the original Star Wars saga and The Empire Strikes Back, where Luke is training with Yoda. And all of a sudden there's like an attack by Darth Vader on his friends. And Luke wants to go and, be their savior. The salvation, the savior is very much a shadow of Neptune, a shadow of the spiritual warrior, the messianic complex in us. We have to remember from Jungian psychology, the hero is a necessary stage that we go through, but it's an immature stage. It's an immature form of psychological development. It's the hero that hasn't been properly initiated into true warriorship, that understands its limitations, that can soberly take a real stock of what is happening on the battlefield, knows when to act, but also knows when to retreat. So in that moment, if Luke was in his mature warrior, he would have realized, he would have taken a moment to assess, to discern, and realize, I'm not yet ready. to fight Darth Vader. My abilities aren't yet mature and skillful enough. And yet he collapses into the hero, goes to fight Darth Vader, and loses and gets his hand chopped off, if you remember. And so he's humiliated. He has to go back to Yoda, and then he trains and becomes that warrior, the Dark Knight, who's embraced his shadow as he wears black in Return of the Jedi. So this is why, mystics are often perceived as those with this kind of like almost outrageous sense of humor, this trickster Hayoka sense of humor, because they realize, that there is this like unknowingness to reality, that the minute we start to act with full absolutism, we're often setting ourselves up for being humbled. So that's why they often speak in riddles and koans. They're just trying to massage the consciousness to be more nimble, to hold both polarities at once. And this is about really unspelling from that matrix of illusions that wants to actually capture us in these duality games, this duality duplicity, as I call it. So, to speak of one of the other prophecies, because these archetypes of the spiritual warrior are so important, and they're like the beautiful gifts of our ancestors. So I want to speak a bit more about the Shambhala warrior, because the Shambhala warrior prophecy that comes from Tibetan Buddhism is so beautiful. And the late great Joanna Macy, if you want to see her deep dive on it, she has a beautiful lecture where she gives us understanding of this archetype so beautifully. But basically, the Shambhala warrior is said to basically come alive in humanity as this force in a time of great darkness, where what they call the opposition, the adversary, the barbarians. And they say in this time when the Shambhala warriors come online, the barbarians have basically colonized the whole planet. There is no sanctity, there is no safe haven. So we have to act from being in them. We have to act while being in this matrix of illusion and duplicity. But the Shambhala warrior doesn't come to fight with might, to fight with violence. It realizes that violence and seeking vengeance actually perpetuates karma and the wheel of suffering. And this is a very hard insight for us to get, and it could be triggering for you. I know it's been triggering for me to really lean into this, because, when we see what's going on in the world, we want to just cry out for justice. We want to proclaim ourselves as righteous agents of justice. But by doing so, we paradoxically actually harden the polarity, because we then follow into Nietzsche's dynamic of fighting monsters, and we see others as monsters ourselves. We might dehumanize them, we might harden our hearts, and then we start acting from the intellect. And then we're liable to crusade against them ourselves, and maybe we'll do something very vile and violent towards them. I know in my own way, in conversations that I've had when I've been possessed by the shadow of the warrior, I can be callous, and I can speak emotionally and fall into character assassinations of another without, trying to have a true understanding conversation debate. It's very hard, especially when we're doing a lot of this online as well, because you can't have a true empathic connection with someone. So we have to be careful, how much time we're spending on our screens. But one of the beautiful things about the Shambhala warrior is it has this awareness that the real adversary in the world is not something that we have to defeat with physical might. It's an inner battle against unconsciousness. It sees that all the suffering in the world is by human beings who have been compromised, who have probably been traumatized themselves, who have been very wounded from a very young age. They may have even been born into situations where they are willfully wounded to keep them compromised from being in their hearts, from betraying their beautiful human essence that truly acts in a spontaneous moral way when we have that clear pathway to our hearts. And so the Shambhala warrior realizes that at the greatest and deepest level, the work is in consciousness. And it also realizes that everything in the world, everything that we may be fighting against, has been made from consciousness, or made rather from unconsciousness. So the real weapon is to awaken more ourselves, to become more conscious, to become more present to our reality, to bring online more of the beauty of and the virtue of our soul to all of our relations each and every day. And this can be hard because people see these things online, they see all the stories of the world, and they want to do something really big and astonishing and grandiose. But we forget that the inner work is actually coming into right relationship with the mundanity of our lives, looking at like, how are my relationships going? How is my relationship to myself? Am I acting present? Am I being a virtuous human being in each and every day of my life? Rather than wanting to go out and fight some big saga, we need to humble ourselves and look at our life and realize life itself is initiating us in all these adversities that are coming up in our personal lives. And that's where we have to concentrate our work on. Another key word about the sacred spiritual warrior is capaciousness. You know, when there's so much horror being thrown at us, you know, the problem is that we can collapse and that we can fall into this duality thinking. But we have to build our capacity to hold all of it somehow. We have to regulate our nervous system, which is the spirit wire system. In Chinese medicine, nerves are called shenjing, which means wires that conduct spirit. And how do we work on our nervous system? With spiritual practices, with breath work, with meditation, with yoga, with qigong. This strengthens the spiritual energetic system. You know, yoga is really about building the energetic realm of the body through the metaphysical, through the physical work, so that we can hold these greater enlightened energies with more capacity, so that we can stay human when we face into the horrors and not become possessed. So the spiritual warrior is also humble because it realizes, wow, we are very vulnerable to being possessed if we are not careful. We're being churned in this Neptune and Aries to really be aware and discerning that we are so vulnerable to fall into illusions. We really want to fight for life, not against the shadows. And we want to let compassion slow down our reactivity so that we're not acting in an uncouth way. And it's really about renunciation of fantasy power and grandiose hero complexes. So this is where it can get, you know, quite tricky, because the spiritual warrior, which is the higher octave of Neptune and Aries, is really about initiating us into a very mature understanding of the power of love. And the love we've been conditioned into is a love that's based on sentimentality, based on romance, based on personal relationships. But the true higher love is impersonal. It unconditionally loves all beings in the world. It realizes that, as I spoke to at the beginning of this talk, we want to have that love rooted as our primary intelligence so that we don't collapse and lose our hearts in the chaos. And this is where we get into a very potent notion of not wanting to fall into hatred. You know, Buddha said, one of the most wise things Buddha said was, hatred never ceases by hating. And I've been having these conversations with a lot of people, especially around the Middle East, because we've been conditioned to harden ourselves, to dehumanize the other, to see the other as an enemy. And we collapse into this endless warringness that just perpetuates it. This is why these conflicts have been going on for centuries, if not thousands of years, because we haven't transcended this duality, duplicity. We've been lost in this unconsciousness of choosing hatred over love. So the higher initiation is that we can see these shadows in ourselves, but we don't organize our souls around it. That we fight for aliveness, for presence, for innocence and beauty in the world, but we don't get so lost in fighting against something. Because when we do that, we're liable to get possessed and fall into warringness. So this is why a lot of the spiritual warriors were, you know, rejected, because they were deemed to be too gentle, and they were kind of pacifists in the sense that they didn't believe in violence, because they just saw, well, violence just can continue this cycle. We're not going to solve anything by killing all of these people. What's going to solve it is first doing our inner work, and then actually creating a new form of justice system based on restorative justice, on redemption justice. Now, this can be very triggering for people, you know, because you see these perpetrators in the world, and I've seen some of the things in the Epstein document. The first thing you want to do is like, we should just, you know, destroy these people. You know, they shouldn't be allowed to be alive anymore. But something that I learned years ago in my spiritual studies, and one of the hardest initiations that I had to go through in my own understanding of the world, was through this Gnostic mystic, Samuel Lavar from Colombia. And he has this beautiful book called The Rebellion of Beelzebub. And Beelzebub is known to be like one of the lieutenants of Satan's army, one of the king demons. And Samuel Lavar was a master astral traveler. So he'd often go into the astral realm and do his spiritual work. And he decides one day to go and find Beelzebub and confront Beelzebub. So he finds this demon somewhere in the astral realm, and Beelzebub and immediately wants to like assault him and create this conflict. And Samuel Lavar is just a spiritual master. He's able to evade all of that. And he's basically speaking to Beelzebub's heart. And he says, I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to redeem you. I'm here to awaken your heart to its true essence as a soul, to its true essence of innocence, and to persuade you to oppose, the vile acts that you're doing in the world, to oppose Satan himself, who you are a slave to. And Beelzebub, runs away in anger and frustration. And Samuel Lavar is just like resilient and relentless. And I think this takes many episodes of astral traveling, but it comes to the point where Beelzebub's just so frustrated with Samuel Lavar, just following him around and constantly calling forth his essence, that he finally admits, I used to be human. I used to be a decent being, and certain things happened to me in life where I became compromised, and I chose this path of darkness, this path of vileness. But there is a part of me that is ashamed, that doesn't want to do this anymore. And then the saga starts to really climax, and eventually Samuel convinces Beelzebub to actually rebel against Satan. He has to go through this sort of process where he ends his contract with Satan. He has to go through all these trials and ordeals, but basically eventually becomes liberated from this servitude, this slavery to Satan's sort of vile acts or vile mission to oppose humanity. So we can take heart with that. We have to sit with that, because when we look at all these perpetrators in the world, all these politicians and people who have been caught in this world of untold, what we might say evil, and vile acts against children and human trafficking, we have to remember that these are also human beings that have been compromised, that have been so wounded, so possessed by the demonic realm. And I believe in all my research that there's whole technologies that these societies have, these secret societies, to make sure that the members are possessed and act through the demonic realm. And they use all kinds of techniques of mind control to do that. But we have to remember these are still human beings. That doesn't mean that we, do what you want, that we permit them to do these things. It means we have to hold them accountable. But that we have to create, and this is one of the frustrating things right now in Neptune and Aries, and people are voicing this, all these things are being revealed, and there's no justice, there's no arrests. And of course we can't be naive. What do we expect? The justice system is completely broken, so we're not going to see solutions there. But wouldn't it be amazing if we could vision a world, and maybe this will be centuries from now, I don't know, a world where people who are perpetrating these evils are actually taken through pathways of healing with all the manner of therapy that we have nowadays, whether it's psychotherapeutic therapy, psychedelic therapy, to actually adjust them, to actually redeem them, to actually purify them, so they can actually be, repentant of the things that they've done in the world. I don't know. Of course, I'm sure you probably think it sounds naive for me to even say these things. But we're also in this Aquarian age, which is an age of newness and pioneering. And I would like to plant these dream seeds that one day we're actually going to have a fully restorative justice system, where criminals aren't punished but transformed. Because if we don't do this work, if we just want to immediately other them as the enemy and just throttle them and even execute them, we've achieved no understanding for what is really going on here. Why are these people doing these things? And it's just going to continue. Like the heads of Hydra, we just lop off one head, another grows. So you're going to continue and continue and continue. What it really needs is for us to build communities where we can be that accountable towards each other, where we can do that healing work each other and start being representatives of a true culture and eventually, hopefully, civilization of enlightenment that is needed, where these kinds of heinous acts don't happen because we've transformed the consciousness that actually makes them happen. So this is a really high test for for people. And I don't want to come out here and say I have any of the answers, really. But we need to start opening up, the mysterious possibility here. Because if we don't, we're just going to continue perpetuating these cycles. The darkness is never destroyed. We have to realize it needs to be re-educated, redeemed, and reintegrated somehow. That's the true nobility of Neptune. To reabsorb what has become estranged. When I was working with these Gnostic studies, there was a particular teaching around what to do when you face a demonic entity. And I remember at the time, I was going to bed one night, and the room was dark, and I could feel, sometimes you feel this kind of creepy presence, and I felt the presence of something very vile in the energetic space of my bedroom. And in the past, I would seek to just sort of escape, which is the shadow of Neptune, escape into my own illusions and just go to bed and think good thoughts and think about whatever, and just ignore it until, thankfully, I've fallen asleep. But instead, because I was in the midst of all this spiritual development, I said, I'm going to actually beam my awareness towards it. Now, the Gnostic teachings had said the first thing you do is you stabilize yourself in your heart. Because love is the true alchemist in the world. Love has that power to transform things. As Samuel showed with Beelzebub, Beelzebub kept trying to shush and get Samuel away from him. But Samuel was like, I actually love you, Beelzebub. I love your essence. I believe in your essence. I love you so much. I'm not going to leave. I'm going to take a stand against you because I'm taking a stand also for you, for your transformation. That is true warrior love. So in that moment, I went into my heart and I filled my heart with light. And then I sent a beam of it to this top corner in my room where I could feel this entity. And immediately, this was all taking place in a visionary metaphysical state. I saw this being all of a sudden become illuminated. It was like a velociraptor. It was like this monstrous demonic form. And it was so angry that I was beaming this love at it. So it tried to get more monstrous. And we started getting almost in this duel where it was throwing all these waves of fearfulness at me. And I was countering with my love. And immediately I started to become aware I'm not afraid. I have so much faith in the power of my heart, in love to transform this being. And these were teachings I had received, so I was following kind of a method. And this being started to become more monstrous. Say the demonic are really shapeshifters. It became bigger and bigger and bigger. It became this brutal behemoth, a monstrosity, but I was not horrified by it. I would not be deterred. I just kept on beaming more and more love. And there was a certain point where it was making these horrendous screams at me that I started to realize the screams were actually of pain. And I started to see, just like in The Wizard of Oz with the Wicked Witch of the West, it started to slowly dissolve. And I started to keep my love empowered and sending it to it, just loving this thing with all this transformational power. And it kept dissolving, till it was like a little bead of light, the essence that it was as a being. And then as I was taught, I just intended for it to be returned to the divine, to that field of consciousness that Neptune represents as the oceanic consciousness. So that was a really powerful moment for me, and I've received other visions of that I've spoke to in some of my other lectures. So this is truly understanding a spiritual form of love that is warrior, a love that doesn't mean permission, a compassion that doesn't mean passivity, and an understanding that does not negate accountability. We can oppose these behaviors while refusing to sever the soul of this being from the field of redemption. So we need to realize that the true battle is against the unconsciousness that this being has veiled upon itself so that it forgets its connection with the essence. So Neptune is really teaching us when we hate this being, we just further this division and then we go into war. While presence, the true power of the heart, love as presence, dissolves it. And I would like to see, and I hope to initiate, more sacred activism where we do group meditations together, where we can bombard these fields of fear and hatred with our love to actually dissolve it. So that we're not destroying the darkness, we're ending the spell, the distortions that are sustaining it. So this is, a very high station that Neptune in Aries is initiating us into. I hope you're seeing that now, that there's a lot of work before us, a lot of really good soul work, soul crafting work. You know, because the spiritual warrior really wants us to, you know, see this corruption in the world, but not to collapse into hatred, to not collapse into humanizing others while we can still oppose the harm that they do, to focus on protecting life, not feeding hatred and falling into outrage and focusing and almost fetishizing this fight against the shadows. That's something I definitely need to take more to heart. Understanding that corruption flourishes when consciousness is outsourced and not rooted as the essence of our being. And then this opens the idea of like, okay, how do we create a more ethical world on a local level in our communities where we can actually start to build this world of light, love, and wisdom, where these types of heinous acts will never occur because humanity has transformed the actual roots that give rise to them. So we fight for life. We fight to protect children. You know, children are the most precious things in the world, and we fight to safeguard truth, to strengthen our communities and cultivate coherence amongst our consciousness. We don't want to be obsessing over the villains, because then we give energy to the darkness. And then we have no energy to give life to these great forms that want to come into being in our world. You know, the real battlefield is our attention. And with the transhumanist revolution that's occurring right now with all the technology, it's definitely ripping us into divisions and distractions. So Neptune in Aries, just to conclude, is really about spiritual warriorhood. It's not about being a crusader who needs an enemy, but having the courage to act from compassion and not collapse our heart. Our heart is where the divine speaks its wisdom to us. When we choose hatred, heart is closed. We're not going to be acting in divine will. So Neptune teaches us that the deepest battle is not against people or even shadows, but it's between presence and unconsciousness. And the awareness that what is created by the mind can also be undone by this more powerful awareness. So Leo is really initiating us into these powers of the heart, these great strengths in the heart, and seeing them as not a weakness, because many of us will feel triggered perhaps when we're hearing these things about redeeming perpetrators and always shining the light of love. You see this all the time, that people deride spirituality as some like new age catchism, that this is weakness, that this is passivity. But I hope I've rendered that this is anything but. And Leo wants us to be more visible. It wants us to be courageously mystical in the world as a form of practicality, because the true mysticism and spiritual work is about having the courage to face yourself, to dissolve the distortions, to come more awake, to not fall asleep into our consciousness, which leads us to all kinds of distortions in our life, from addictions to abuse. It wants us to be in a nobility and to realize the vertical path of spiritual development is a very hard path. It means every single day I'm going to wake up and treat this as the last day of my life. I'm going to give my best. I'm going to give my best every moment, whether it's the mundanity of washing the dishes, to feeling the sensuality of the water on my fingers, to every broken relationship in my life. I'm going to try and repair. I'm going to try and be present to others, to create so much capacity in my heart that I can love the world, which is really the king and the queen archetype, being a world maker, a lover of the world. This is the true seat of authority in the world. Heart-based leadership. And what we are seeing right now in Neptune and Aries, we are seeing this unmasking, this dissolution of the current illusion that the authority figures in our world are compromised. They are not acting by their hearts. But instead of being completely consumed by the rage for that, we might want to ask ourselves, well, how can we be more heart-based leaders, to be paragons, inspirers for others? How can we create communities where that seat of true authority in the heart is what leads their craft? So we must be more heroic and courageous with this kind of heart-led leadership, to really show the world, to use it as a lighthouse, to call the world to act more decisively from the heart, from this fierce love that grounds us in our divine humanity, so they don't get compromised and fall into shadow and fall into becoming demonic ourselves. This is really, really big work, because there is a lot of grief in the world that needs to be felt too, and we need to create space for that. But we need to primarily be giving space for our spiritual practices to keep us centered, to keep us, really connected to the wisdom of our souls, which are housed in the heart. So, I think I'll leave it there. Whew. Feels like a potent transmission. I see there's people watching. If you have any questions or in the comments or anything you want to comment, I'll just leave a space here at the end here. But really, to take heart as well in these archetypes. Research the Rainbow Warrior. Research the Shambhala Warrior. The Earth Knight is another beautiful archetype that comes from the Warrior Within books, the masculine archetype books. They talk about how the spiritual warrior is a warrior for the earth, for all life on earth. Not just humanity, but for all beings. This is a huge thing that we're unconscious to, that we're asleep to. We're so beset on fighting amongst ourselves, we're not realizing the earth is becoming uninhabitable for us. And how humiliating would that be, that we're fighting a war on some battlefield somewhere in the world, and all of a sudden the whole ecology collapses on the planet. We can't even sustain ourselves. That's the kind of insanity that we need to look into. We need to actually fight for all the life forms that are our family on the earth. The plants, the trees, the animals, these are our brethren. And this is why we're also witnessing the awakening to the consciousness of Gaia, to Mother Earth, who is our true wisdom teacher, as all my indigenous teachers have bestowed upon me. This is why we go on the vision quest, why we go out into nature, to hook into her. And her ancient name was Sophia, which is the goddess of wisdom. That is the wisdom that she's perpetually teaching us. She is our most ancient wisdom teacher. And we also want to remember the white lions, the prophecy that the white lions were the guardians of humanity. We can call on the white lions to be our spiritual protectors in these times. Call on them as much as you need. So I'll leave it there. And just to speak about Gaia for a moment, because that's a huge part of my work. Next weekend, I am hosting a beautiful talk on the Shift Network on Gaian sound healing work, about how I've been bringing this medicine of sound healing into restoring consciousness of the great goddess in our world. And you can see that event on Facebook. You can find it on my page. And I'm also very happy to announce that on February 17th, on the new moon Aquarius, my new album, The Awakening of Gaia, which is 6 journey music songs, ambient song channeling music to connect us to the consciousness of Gaia, will be coming out. And I just released a new one today called Anima Mundi, which is a song channeling for the soul of Mother Earth, which you can find on my YouTube channel. So I'll have much more to share in the coming days. I'm going to be ramping up a lot of things in the realm of sacred activism. But for now, just sending you all so much love. Be in your hearts. Stay in your hearts. Visualize a white lion, lioness in your hearts, empowering you. There's so much being thrown at us, so much horror in the world. But there's so much beauty. There's way more beauty than horror. And don't forget that. Don't collapse into hatred. Continue to let love be your leader. The divine in me sees the divine in you. Namaste. Awen.